She fell for the third time in less than a mile. This time the snow swallowed her up like to the chest. Hands wrapped in torn cloth clawed frantically at the ice, not to push herself up, to find something she'd just dropped, a scrap of paper, small, soaked through. On it, a name she had never met, in a city 2,000 miles away. Behind her, along the snow-covered road, stretched a thin trail of blood, not much, just enough for the wolves to find their way. The wind shrieked through the pines like someone weeping. In the distance, the yellow lights of a town flickered, close enough to be cruel. She stood up, took another step. In a saloon half a mile away, a man lifted a glass of whiskey to his lips, then set it down without drinking. The 11th night in a row. He didn't know why his hand was shaking tonight. The saloon door swung open. The cold came first, before the snow, before the wind that bent the pine trees sideways along the ridge, before the sky turned the shade of gray that old-timers in Clearwater, Wyoming, called a widow sky. The cold came first, settling into the valley like something that had always lived there and was only now known. December 1877. The kind of December that killed people who weren't paying attention. Caleb Harmon was not paying attention. He sat at the same table he had occupied for 11 nights running. Same corner of the Ironwood Saloon. Same glass of whiskey ordered an hour ago and barely touched. The glass was warm now, room temperature, which meant it wasn't doing what whiskey was supposed to do. Nothing was doing what it was supposed to do lately. The Ironwood was loud the way frontier saloons were always loud. Cards slapping felt. Boots scraping sawdust floors. Men laughing at jokes that weren't funny because laughing at unfunny jokes was what men did when they didn't want to sit with silence. The wood stove in the corner threw heat in a 10-foot radius and absolute nothing beyond that. The windows were black with night and frost. Caleb stared at his glass, 30 years old, 6'2". Hands that had built fence lines in frozen ground and pulled calves into the world at 3 in the morning. And once, when he was 22, held his father steady in a saddle for 4 miles, when the man was too proud to admit a horse had cracked 2 of his ribs. Hands that knew how to work. Hands that didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. The ranch was fine. That was almost the worst part. The Harmon spread, 480 acres of good grass and reliable water. The south pasture where the soil ran dark and deep, the west corridor along Cowboy Creek, all the way to the upper ridge. The ranch was fine. He'd sold the autumn cattle at fair price. The structures were sound. The horses were healthy. Everything was fine. Mabel had been dead for 18 months. Scarlet fever. 4 days from first symptom to last breath. She was 27 years old, and she had laughed at something he said. The morning, before the fever found her, and he could not remember now, no matter how hard he tried, what the joke had been. He remembered the laugh. He did not remember the joke. That seemed important somehow. The shape of the thing he'd lost. He picked up the whiskey glass, set it down again without drinking. 11 nights at this table. 11 nights of watching other men live their lives in real time, noisy and imperfect and ongoing, while his own life sat somewhere outside his body like a coat he'd forgotten how to put on. His ranch foreman, old Pete Graves, had quit in October, not from cruelty, from pity, which was worse. Can't watch you run that place into the ground by standing still, Caleb. Come find me when you're ready to be a rancher again. The 2 hands he'd kept on through winter were capable enough. They didn't need him to function, which was maybe the problem. He was 30 years old, and he was not needed anywhere. The door opened. Cold air hit the room like a slap. Every man looked up, not from politeness, from instinct, because that much cold meant something significant was happening outside. And significant things in December in Wyoming were rarely good news. Dr. Aldrich came in first, 60-something. White beard trimmed close. The kind of doctor who had seen enough death to be genuinely unimpressed by it, which made him exceptionally good at preventing it. He was not a man who alarmed easily. He looked alarmed. He held the door open behind him. And then she was there. She was not what Caleb expected. Some part of his brain, still half asleep from 11 nights of deliberate numbness, had constructed something. A traveler in distress, a woman of obvious fragility, someone who looked like the storm had broken her. She did not look broken. She looked like the storm had tried and failed. 22, maybe 23. Dark hair plastered against her face in wet strips where the snow had melted. A coat that had been adequate for a St. Louis autumn and was catastrophically insufficient for a Wyoming December. Hands wrapped in cloth strips that had started the day as something else entirely. Her lips were the wrong color, blue at the edges fading to white at the center, but her eyes green, not the soft green of new grass. The green of something that had survived being buried under snow all winter and was still, improbably, alive. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the expression of a person doing rapid and unsentimental calculation, not panic, not pleading, just assessment. Who are these men? What do they want? What can I work with here? Caleb had never seen that look on a woman in that condition before. It made him sit up straighter. Dr. Aldrich let the door close. He did not shout. He didn't need to. The room had already gone quiet. This young woman, Dr. Aldrich said, in the flat, precise tone of a man delivering medical information, walked in from Grover Station, on foot. In this weather, 15 miles, silence. The stage left her at the station 3 hours ago because she was short on fare. She has been walking since. He paused. Let that settle. If she doesn't get warm, get fed, and get a bed tonight, I cannot guarantee she sees morning. 20 men in the Ironwood Saloon, Caleb counted later. 20 men at cards and at the bar and at tables with their drinks and their ordinary evenings. 20 men who heard a doctor say, I cannot guarantee she sees morning. Not one of them moved, not one. He didn't plan it, didn't think it through, didn't weigh anything against anything else. His body just decided. The chair scraped back. He was standing before his brain caught up. Sit down, he said, before you fall down. He said it to her directly. Not to the room, to her. She looked at him. That green-eyed assessment, faster this time, running over him like she was reading a document, and needed the key information quickly. Then she walked to his table. Steadily, with more dignity than he had any right to expect, from someone who had walked 15 miles in a blizzard with hands, wrapped in what he could now identify as a torn petticoat hem. She sat down across from him. And just like that, the room went back to being a room. He ordered without asking what she wanted. Coffee, the hottest they had, and whatever Hattie had in the kitchen. Stew, probably. He didn't care. Neither would she. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug when it came and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she opened them and looked at him. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Rough at the edges from cold, but the shape of it, the way she formed words, told him things. Educated. Not performing education the way some people did, dropping words like calling cards. Just actually educated. The easy, unself-conscious way that meant someone had made it ordinary for her. Eat first, he said, so she did. She did not eat like someone embarrassed about being hungry. She ate like someone who understood that hunger was a practical problem, requiring a practical solution, and that drawing out the process served no one. Steadily, efficiently, without apology. He liked that. He did not examine why he liked that. Nora Whitfield. She said eventually, when half the stew was gone, my father was a schoolteacher in St. Louis was. He caught the tense. Didn't comment. Let her decide how much to say. She decided to say most of it. The way she told the story was not the way he expected. No tears, no pauses for sympathy. She laid it out like a series of facts that had happened to someone she knew well, and felt things about privately, and was not currently inviting him into those private feelings. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, 38 years a schoolteacher, had died of cholera in the spring. The landlord of their boarding house had sold everything in their 2 rooms against back rent owed. She had not blamed him for that. It was what he was owed. She had started walking west 2 days after the funeral, 6 weeks of working her way across. Laundry, mending, cooking, anything that paid in money rather than promises, because promises didn't buy stage fare. She'd made it to Kansas before the money ran thin, Colorado before it ran out entirely, Grover Station with enough coins to pay most of the fare to Clearwater, most. Not all. The driver had not been unkind about it, she said. He'd simply been operating a business. She said this without bitterness. That was the part that got him. Not the loss, not the 15 miles. The complete absence of bitterness about a man who had left her at a station in a December storm because she was 70 cents short. California, she said. That's where I'm trying to get. I have a second cousin there. She says there's work. She said, says not said. Present tense. California was still the plan, even now. Even tonight, still the plan. Caleb picked up his whiskey glass, set it down again. Looked at this woman across the table, Nora Whitfield with her terrible coat and her warm now hands, and her green eyes doing that calculation thing again, probably at him, probably wondering what category of person he was and what she could work with. His mind did something unexpected. It woke up. Here is what Caleb Harmon did not say out loud. Sitting in the Ironwood Saloon on that December night, he did not say, "My father died 14 months ago and left a will with a clause I have been trying not to think about." He did not say. The clause specifies that the West Pasture, 160 acres of the best land on the Harmon spread, the land with the creek access and the winter grass, and the value that makes the whole operation work, transfers to my younger brother Silas, if I am not married before my 31st birthday. He did not say, "My 31st birthday is 9 months away." He did not say, "Silas Harmon is not a bad man. He is simply a man who has always wanted what I have, and he has always known exactly which specific thing of mine he wanted most." He did not say any of that. What he said was this: "I have a ranch, 480 acres, good water, good grass, solid structures." He kept his voice level. The way he'd talk about cattle prices. "What I cannot do is keep running a place meant for more than one person. I am tired of it." He stopped. Started again. "I need a partner. Someone who will work alongside me and build something that lasts. Someone present in a house that hasn't had anyone really present in it for a long time." Nora set her spoon down, looked at him with those calculating eyes. "Are you proposing marriage?" she said. Not a question. A clarification. "Yes, to me. You're the one at the table." She stared at him. He waited. "You've known me for?" She glanced at the window, estimated. 20 minutes. "About that. You don't know anything about me. I know you walked 15 miles rather than stop. I know you ate your supper without pretending not to be hungry. I know you told me hard facts about your life without asking me to feel sorry for you." He met her eyes. "I know you're sitting here doing arithmetic about me right now instead of panicking. That's more than I know about most people I've known for years." Silence. The saloon noise went on around them. Oblivious, indifferent, a whole other world 3 feet away. "What exactly?" Nora said carefully. "Are you getting out of this?" There it was. The question with the right shape. The question that meant she was actually thinking about it. He answered part of it. The true part. "A reason to go back to the ranch," he said. "A reason to care whether the place runs well or runs to ground. Someone to build something with, instead of just maintaining what's already there." He paused. "I have been sitting in this saloon for 11 nights, and I could not tell you what day of the week it is." He didn't tell her about the will. He told himself it was because there wasn't time, because the facts needed to be clear before the complications entered, because she deserved to make her decision based on what was real and present. He told himself a lot of things. The honest part of him, the part that Marshall Cutter had always been able to read like a bill of sale, knew that he wasn't entirely sure of his own motives, and that uncertainty was its own kind of answer. "I am not talking about a business arrangement," he said. I am talking about a real marriage. Time to know each other. Time to build something genuine. I would not demand more than you were willing to give. I would never raise a hand to you, would never deny you food or shelter or dignity. I would listen when you speak, work hard to provide for both of us. That is the most honest promise I can make. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't love you. I don't love you either. That's not, I mean. For the first time, something flickered in her face that wasn't calculation. Almost wry. Almost. Most men would at least pretend. Would you prefer I pretend? She thought about it. Seriously. Actually thought about it. No, she said. Then here is what I think is true, Caleb said. Respect is more than most marriages start with. Love, real love, the kind that holds, that grows from something, from working alongside someone, from seeing who a person is when things are hard. We could start with respect and see what grows. Nora looked at him for a long time. I want children, she said. If we're talking about a real marriage, I need to know you want that too. I do. I want to keep learning. My father raised me to value it, and I won't give that up. Books. Newspapers. My mother had a library. Hasn't been touched in years. It would be yours. And if it doesn't work, her chin came up slightly. If we discover we are genuinely incompatible, what then? Then we would have to work it out. Same as any married couple, he held her gaze. I'm not offering you easy, Nora. I'm offering you real. Outside, the wind hit the building in a gust that shook the door in its frame. Snow against glass, like static. The winter pressing its case. Let me sleep on it, she said finally. One night. You pay for a room at the boarding house, and I'll give you my answer in the morning. And if the answer is no, then you pay for a week and help me find other work. And we forget this conversation happened. He nodded. Fair enough. Mrs. Weston ran the boarding house on Cedar Street the way a general runs a campaign. Total authority, extreme efficiency, deep personal investment in the outcome. She was 60 years old, stout, gray-braided, and had developed a firm personal policy through decades of hard luck cases. No judgment, clean linens, and hot water whenever possible. She took one look at Nora Whitfield and had hot water on the stove in 4 minutes. Caleb paid for 2 rooms, separate floors, and stood in the parlor while Mrs. Weston led Nora upstairs. He could hear through the ceiling the sound of water being poured. Then silence. Then, very faintly, something he couldn't quite identify. He sat down in the parlor chair that guests weren't really supposed to use and stayed there. His mind was moving again. After 11 nights of careful stillness, after 11 nights of sitting in the Ironwood, staring at a warm whiskey glass, and successfully thinking about almost nothing, his mind was moving and it would not stop. He pulled out the letter from his inside coat pocket. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks. His father's lawyer, a man named Dobbins in Cheyenne, had sent it in November. Caleb had read it twice and then folded it and put it in his pocket and carried it like a stone ever since. He read it again now in the lamplight. The terms of the late Mr. Robert Harmon's last will and testament are clear on this point. The 160 acres, designated as the western parcel, including the creek corridor and the associated water rights, shall transfer to the second son, Silas Harmon. In the event that the first son, Caleb Harmon, has not contracted a legal marriage by the date of his 31st birthday, 9 months, he folded the letter, put it back. He had not stood up in the Ironwood because of this letter. He knew that with the clarity that comes from genuine self-examination, in quiet rooms late at night, he had stood up because a doctor said a woman might not survive the night, and no one else moved. He had proposed because something in him had suddenly, unexpectedly, desperately wanted a reason to go home. But the letter existed, and he hadn't mentioned it. And that silence was going to mean something, sooner or later. He could feel its weight already, sitting in the room with him like a guest no one had invited. He would tell her. He decided that, sitting in the parlor chair in the lamplight, before the wedding, if she said yes, he would tell her. He didn't sleep. He stayed downstairs and listened to the storm work against the building. and thought about his father and the West pasture, and a woman who had walked 15 miles in a blizzard, rather than give up on a plan that was already in ruins. He thought about her eyes. That green, that alive shade of green, he thought. I have not noticed the color of anything in 18 months. He did not figure out what that meant. He sat in the chair until the lamp burned down. Then he sat in the dark. Morning came gray and cold and quiet. The storm had spent itself overnight and left behind a world rearranged in white. Clearwater looked clean in the early light. Every rough edge smoothed, every familiar outline altered just enough to seem new. Caleb stood on the boarding house porch at first light watching the town come back to life. He heard the door behind him, turned. Nora was dressed in the same clothes as the night before, cleaned as best she could. Hair braided back simply. She looked, in the morning light, younger than she had in the saloon. And also, he couldn't explain this exactly, more solid. Like sleep had returned something to her that the cold had taken. She looked at him. He waited. I've been thinking, she said, about options. My options? Specifically, she came to stand a few feet away looking at the white street. Not at him. At the town. If I continue west, I need money I don't have for a stage I can't fully pay for, to reach a cousin I've never actually met, in a city I've never seen, for work that may or may not still be available. She paused. Those are the facts. Yes, he said. I also thought about what you said. About respect being more than most marriages start with, a beat. My parents married for love. They were happy. But I watched them build their respect for each other over 20 years, day by day. Maybe what you're proposing is just doing it in a different order. He didn't speak. Let her get there herself. I thought about the way you stood up, she said quietly. In the saloon. Not dramatically. Not making a speech. You just stood up, like it was obvious. Like sitting back down wasn't an option you'd considered. She finally looked at him. I've been in a lot of rooms in the last 6 weeks, where men sat back down. The morning light hit the snow at an angle that made it hurt to look at directly. One question, she said. Before I give you my answer, all right. She turned to face him fully. The direct look. That unsentimental taking of measure that he was already recognizing as simply her. Are you a man who keeps his word? He could have said many things. He had kept his word to his father for 30 years. He had never broken a contract or a handshake deal, or a promise made to any person who had a right to hold him to it. He could have said all of that. Instead, ask anyone in Clearwater. She held his gaze. I'm asking you, yes, he said. Simple, no ornamentation. I keep my word. She nodded once. Then yes, I'll marry you. Caleb did not feel relief. He had expected relief. Instead, he felt something more complicated. A mixture of rightness and unease that he recognized, from long experience, as the sensation of having made a decision that was going to matter for a very long time. He had still not told her about the will. He had decided, the night before, that he would tell her before the wedding. And here was the morning, and here was the light, and here was this woman, saying yes with her chin up and her green eyes steady. He opened his mouth, the boarding house door opened. Darshol Cutter came out. Eli Cutter was 61 years old, and had been keeping the peace in Clearwater for going on 19 years. Not a large man. He'd never needed to be large. He carried the gravity of someone who said exactly what he meant and expected to be taken seriously, and was universally taken seriously. He wore a badge and a colt and an expression that had seen through most things. Most people tried to hide behind. He looked at Nora. He looked at Caleb, Mrs. Weston told me, he said. Thought I'd get some air. Nora glanced between them. She said, I'll go see about breakfast, and went back inside with the tact of someone whose father had raised her well. Cutter waited until the door closed. Then he looked at Caleb with that look. The one that had been making men in Clearwater tell the truth since 1858. I've known you since you were 16 years old, Cutter said. I knew your father. I've watched you be a fair and decent man in a territory where that is not always the easiest thing to be. Thank you, Caleb said carefully. So don't make me regret any of that. Cutter's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. If that woman in there is a signature on a document to you. If this is about the West pasture, and Robert Harmon's will and the deadline sitting on your head right now. He paused, each word landing separately. Then I'll know, and one day, so will she. And the kind of man you've been your whole life will mean a great deal less than you'd like it to. Caleb said nothing. Cutter watched him not say it. Right, the marshal said, after a moment. Well, congratulations on the upcoming wedding. He went back inside. Caleb stood on the porch in the cold for a long time. He thought about the West pasture. 160 acres, the creek corridor. The winter grass that kept the cattle through February. He thought about Nora Whitfield eating her supper without apology. Walking 15 miles without stopping. Saying I'm asking you, when she could have accepted the easier answer. He thought about the word yes, coming out of her mouth in the morning light, and what it had done to the thing in his chest that had been still for 18 months. He went inside for breakfast. The letter in his inside pocket stayed folded. The wedding took place at 11 o'clock in the morning. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony in the small white church at the edge of town. He raised both eyebrows at the 24-hour courtship and said nothing about it, because he was a man of practical faith who had married people under stranger circumstances than this. Mrs. Weston and Dr. Aldrich served as witnesses. Mrs. Weston cried. Dr. Aldrich looked at Nora with the expression of a man who had told a room she might survive the night, and was now watching her get married to one of the more reliable ranchers in the county. Satisfied. The way a doctor looks at a patient who has decided, against all reasonable expectation, to live. The church was cold. The small stove in the corner did its best. Nora wore the same dress, cleaned. She had borrowed a blue ribbon from Mrs. Weston and tied it into her braid. The only concession she made to ceremony. Caleb spoke the vows with more conviction than he expected. He had thought, not having examined it carefully, that he would feel the performance of the thing, the going through motions. He had been through this once before, 9 years ago, in this same church, with Mabel, in a ceremony that had felt sacred and large and terrifying. He had expected this to feel small by comparison. Provisional. It didn't. He said, I will and I do, until death do us part, and meant all of it with a seriousness that startled him, like the words themselves knew something he didn't. Like saying them aloud activated something he hadn't consciously decided to activate. Nora spoke her own vows steadily. Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes stayed on his face throughout, not soft, not romantic. Present fully, completely present. Like she was making a decision all the way through, even now, right up to the last moment, when Reverend Marsh said man and wife, and Caleb leaned down and kissed her. Gently, briefly, just the shape of a promise. Nora was still for a moment, surprised or deciding or both. Then she was not still. They stepped out into the snow together. Well, Nora said, her breath making a small cloud. I suppose I'm Mrs. Harmon now? We'll head to the ranch tomorrow morning, he said. Let the road clear overnight. Nora shook her head. Today. I want to see it today. He looked at the sky. The storm had gone. The road would be slow but passable. Cold but survivable. Which for a woman who had walked 15 miles the previous night was not a high bar. All right, he said. They bought supplies at Tillman's General Store. Caleb watching while Nora moved through the shelves. She chose with focus, practical, no ornamentation, nothing that wasn't necessary. A warm coat, proper wool, winter weight, boots that fit, gloves, 2 changes of clothes in sturdy fabric. A small medical kit. She picked up a novel halfway through. Middlemarch, George Eliot. Turned it over, then put it back on the shelf. Get the book, Caleb said. It's not necessary. You said you wanted to keep your mind sharp. Get the book. She looked at him. Got the book. He paid for everything. She watched the amount without comment. He could see her filing it away. What it meant that he'd spent it without hesitation. She didn't argue. She simply said, thank you, in a tone that meant she would account for it. That they would account for it. Together, later, he liked that too. They rode out at midday, heading north-northwest toward the Harmon spread. Caleb's bay gelding, Trace, carrying them both with the patient indifference of a horse who had carried heavier loads in worse weather. Nora sat in front, Caleb's arm around her waist for balance, the pack horse trailing behind with supplies. She was warm against him, more solid than her frame suggested. She moved with the horse easily, not an experienced rider, but someone who understood the basic principle of not fighting what was carrying you. He pointed things out as they rode. That creek, Callaway Creek, runs through the lower pasture. Never freezes completely, even in January. The cattle know to go there when the top water's iced over. She looked where he pointed. What's the depth in summer? He blinked. About knee-deep in the center channel, good for irrigation? We've done it. Not systematically. My father had a book about dry farming techniques. There might be ways to extend the kitchen garden. Lengthen the growing season. Caleb looked at the back of her head, at the blue ribbon in her braid, at the way she was already on the road, in the cold, on the way to see it for the first time, thinking about the land as hers, as theirs. That stand of trees, he said, aspens. They go gold in October. My mother used to. He stopped, started again. She used to say it was the only proof she needed that God had a sense of beauty. Nora was quiet for a moment then. What was her name? Louise. She sounds like a woman worth knowing she was. The miles passed. The light moved across the snow at a low angle, casting long shadows and pale golds. The mountains were enormous to the west belt, white-peaked, ancient, entirely indifferent to everything happening in the valley below. Nora rode without complaint, without asking how far, without any sign of a person counting miles and resenting them. She looked at everything. He watched her look at everything. The ranch came into view at late afternoon, when the sun was almost gone and the light had turned deep amber, the kind that made everything look deliberate and significant. The house first. 2 stories, logs and stone, wide porch running the full front length. Glass windows, still a luxury in this territory, catching the amber light and throwing it back in warm squares. Behind it, the barn, the stable, the outbuildings. Fences running in geometric certainty across the snow-covered pastures, marking what was held, what was kept, what was maintained. Nora went still on the horse in front of him. He felt it. The change in her breathing. It's beautiful, she said quietly. He had not seen it as beautiful in a long time. He had seen it as work, as obligation, as the thing his parents built that he was responsible for not destroying. From behind her, with her looking at it for the first time, he could see it again. It's home, he said. And then, before he could stop himself, our home. Now, she turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him, looking at the word, maybe. Turning it over the way she'd turned over the book in Tillman's. Our home, she said, testing the weight of it. He helped her down from Trace and led her to the front door. The inside was cold. The stoves had been out for days. Caleb got the kitchen stove going first, then the fireplace in the main room. He could hear Nora moving through the house while his back was turned, her boots on the floorboards, doors opening and closing softly. The quiet of someone who has not snooping, but looking carefully, taking measure of the space they've agreed to share. When he turned from the fireplace, she was standing in the doorway of the small study. The bookshelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. His mother's collection, history and philosophy, and novels and almanacs, and 2 full shelves of botany texts ordered from a printer in Boston. They hadn't been touched in 5 years. There was dust on the spines. Nora was standing very still in the doorway, just looking at them. He didn't say anything, let her look. After a moment, she turned and found him watching her. She didn't say anything either, but something shifted in her face, something that was not quite calculation anymore. He showed her the upstairs, 3 bedrooms. His parents' room, the master, large bed frame, Solid mattress, wardrobe built into the wall, the east-facing window that caught the sunrise over the upper pasture. He had not slept in it since his mother died. He had been sleeping in the small room at the end of the hall, like a man waiting for something. "This will be our room," he said, setting her things on the bed. Nora looked at the bed, looked at him, Caleb, direct, unhesitating. "I need to tell you something." "All right. I'm not ready for everything that usually comes with marriage." "Not yet. Not immediately." She met his eyes without flinching. "I need time to know you, actually know you." Before that, he had expected this. "I'll take the room at the end of the hall," he said. "Until you're ready." The relief in her face was immediate. Then, something else. Surprise, maybe, that he hadn't argued, that he hadn't negotiated. "You're not angry," she said. "Why would I be angry? I proposed to you yesterday. I can't expect your trust in a day." He paused. "Trust is earned, Nora, not demanded." She looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded, once. That decisive nod he was already recognizing as her way of closing a subject she'd finished thinking about. "Then I'll learn how to make this kitchen work," she said, and went downstairs. Caleb stood in the doorway of his parents' room and listened to the sounds of her moving below. Water being drawn, the stove being assessed, the quiet authority of a person making themselves at home in a space that is new to them. He had carried the letter in his pocket all day. He had meant to tell her. He carried it down the hall to the small room at the end, set it on the windowsill in the dark, looked at it. Tomorrow, he thought, he would tell her tomorrow. The wind had stopped. From somewhere downstairs came the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. She had found what was in the pantry faster than he would have. And then a sound that took him a moment to identify. She was humming, quickly, almost to herself, some tune he didn't recognize. Caleb sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room at the end of the hall. Listened to a human being be present in his house for the first time in 18 months. Something in his chest, the thing that had been very still for a long time, moved. Not much, just enough. The first week was mostly silence. Not the bad kind. Not the silence of two people who have nothing to say and know it. The silence of two people paying close attention and not yet decided what to do with what they're learning. Caleb learned this. Nora woke before he expected her to. Every morning. He'd come down the stairs at 4:30, quiet as he could, and find the kitchen stove already burning. Coffee already on. Not waiting for him specifically, just done. Because it needed doing. Because that was how she approached every task that needed doing. Efficiently, without ceremony. Without waiting to be asked, Nora learned this. Caleb did not manage the ranch the way a man manages something he loves. He managed it the way a man manages something he is afraid of losing. There's a difference. She could see it in how he checked the same fence line twice, how he walked the south pasture at dusk, even when there was no reason to, how he stood at the barn door sometimes in the early morning and just looked at all of it, like he was counting it, making sure it was still there. She didn't say anything about that, but she noticed. The days had a shape to them by the end of the first week. Caleb out before dawn. Cattle, horses, the long cold work of winter ranch maintenance. Nora up minutes after. Fire, coffee. Whatever the pantry offered that could be turned into something worth eating, which turned out to be more than Caleb expected. Because his pantry, under her management, became a different kind of place. Organized. Inventoried. Extended by careful planning into meals that didn't feel like survival. They worked together on the larger tasks without discussing it much. He'd start on the fence and she'd appear with tools and just begin, on the other end, working toward him. They'd meet in the middle. He'd check her work. It would be correct. He would nod. She would nod back. That would be the whole exchange. She learned from watching, not from asking, which he appreciated. Which also unnerved him slightly, because it meant she was always watching, and he was not entirely sure what she was seeing. Night 6. 2 in the morning, Caleb was in the barn. One of the horses, A gray mare named Cedar, who had been difficult since October, was moving wrong in her stall. Not lame, just off, restless. He was standing there, lantern low, watching her settle, breath-making clouds in the cold air. When the cough started, not Cedar, him. The kind of cough that starts at the back of the throat and becomes a project. 3 weeks of working outside in December weather without enough sleep. He'd been ignoring it the way men ignore things they don't have time for. He coughed for about 2 minutes, solid. Cedar looked at him with reproach. He got her settled, went back inside, did not mention the cough to the empty house. Went to bed. In the morning he came downstairs and found a pot on the stove. Not coffee. Broth. Thick, good-smelling, made from the ham bone he'd had in the back of the pantry and vegetables. And something herbed that his mother used to add to sick day soups when he was small. He couldn't name what it was, but he knew the smell. Nora was already outside, working on the chicken coop latch that had been sticking since November. The pot was on low heat. No note. He stood in his coat and looked at the pot for a long moment. Then he ladled some into a mug and drank it, standing at the window watching her work on the latch. She fixed it in 15 minutes, came inside stamping snow off her boots, saw him with the mug, said nothing. Just went to the stove and checked the fire. "Thank you," he said. "The latch was the last thing on the list," she said. "I'll start on the storage room shelving next if the weather holds. Not, you're welcome. Not, I heard you coughing. Not, I was worried. Just, the latch is done. Here's what's next." He drank his soup. Something in his chest cracked open slightly, very slightly, like ice at the edge of a creek in early thaw. The kind of crack you can hear but can't see yet. Week 2, Tuesday. He found her at the east fence, the section along the tree line where the posts were oldest, and the wire had been repaired so many times it looked like an argument between different decades. She was trying to reset a post that had heaved up in the freeze, doing it wrong. Not badly wrong, just wrong in the way someone goes wrong, when they figured out the principle, but not the specific technique for this specific soil type, in this specific temperature. He could have told her. Instead, he walked to the other end of the section, picked up the spare tools, started working on his end. She looked up, watched for about 30 seconds, then adjusted her approach to match. They worked toward each other for 2 hours. The temperature was in the low teens. Their breath made continuous clouds. The only sounds were metal on frozen ground and the occasional protest of old wire being persuaded into new configuration. They met in the middle. He checked her section. Every post solid, every wire tight. He nodded. She nodded back. They walked back to the house for coffee, and neither said a word about it, and somehow that was more than words would have been. Like they had established something without needing to name it, a working language, a shorthand built from shared labor. Week 3, Friday. 3 in the morning, the sound came from the barn. Caleb was up in 30 seconds. Boots on, coat grabbed. He hit the barn door at a run and found exactly what he'd feared. The black heifer, barely 2 years old, down on her side. First calf. Coming too early. Coming wrong. He had his hands on her, before he'd fully processed the situation. The calf was turned. He could feel it. He'd done this before, twice, successfully, once not, and he knew the next hour would require every bit of his concentration and more luck than he usually asked for. He did not hear Nora come in. He registered her presence at some point. Lantern light increasing, warmth near his shoulder, but could not look up. She did not say anything. She just moved, got water, got the rope he'd need, got the clean rags from the shelf, where he kept them for exactly this purpose without being told where they were. Because she had spent 3 weeks learning where everything was. She positioned herself at the heifer's head, one hand steady on the animal's neck, talking low and continuous, not to Caleb, to the cow. Something about the cold and the dark and how this was almost over an hour. Maybe more. The calf came into the world at 4:15 in the morning, alive, indignant about it. Which was the best possible outcome. Caleb sat back against the stall wall, arms exhausted, front of his coat ruined. Watching the calf try and fail and try again to understand its own legs, Nora was still at the heifer's head, still talking low, and then, there it was. Her first real laugh, not polite, not controlled. Genuine laughter startled out of her by the calf's furious wobbling. The sound of it filled the barn and hit the cold air and scattered. He looked at her. She looked at him, her face in the lantern light, covered in evidence of the last hour. Hair escaping from its braid. Eyes bright with the kind of alive that only comes from being present at the beginning of something. She was still laughing. He thought, I have not heard a sound like that in a very long time. His hand was next to hers on the stall rail. He did not move his hand, she did not move hers. They stayed like that for a minute. Maybe two. In the cold barn. In the dark with the heifer recovering. And the calf figuring out gravity. And neither of them saying a single word about any of it. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Wednesday in late January. Caleb recognized Dobbins's handwriting on the envelope and felt his stomach drop before he'd broken the seal. He read it standing at the kitchen table. Then he stood there for a while longer. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Then he took it out and read it again. Then he put it back. Nora came in from the storage room, where she'd been working on the inventory. Saw his face. Stopped, he said. Sit down. She sat. He sat across from her. He put the letter on the table between them, did not push it toward her, just placed it there. Let her decide whether to reach for it. She reached for it. He watched her read. Watched her eyes track across Dobbins's careful legal language. Watched her reach the relevant clause. The one about the West pasture, the one about his 31st birthday, the one about Silas. And slow down. Read it again. Continue to the end. She put the letter down. She looked at him. He did not look away. You knew about this, she said. When you proposed, yes, silence. And you didn't tell me no. More silence. The kitchen fire was the only sound. Occasional crack of wood. Wind against the north wall. Why? She said. Not angry. Not yet. Just asking. This was the part he had rehearsed in the small room at the end of the hall for weeks. The part he had tried to get right, to find words that were true without being excuses, honest without being performances of honesty. Because I don't know, he said, even now. Exactly where one thing ended and the other began. I had been sitting in that saloon for 11 nights not caring about anything. And then you walked in and something in me woke up. I stood up because of you, not because of the will, he paused. But the will was there, it was real, and I didn't tell you. And I've been trying to figure out every day, since whether that silence was cowardice or whether it was something I told myself was protection and was actually cowardice, dressed up. Nora looked at the letter, then at him. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. He blinked. I mean it, she said. That answer just now. That was honest, not polished. Honest, she looked back at the letter. How long? 9 months from the wedding. 8 now. And if the court decides the marriage isn't valid, the west pasture goes to Silas. The remaining land stays mine. The operation is compromised. Significantly, she nodded slowly. Processing. Then, did you mean what you said at the altar? Not a question. A calibration. I meant it, he said. More than I understood at the time. She looked at him for a long time. The way she'd looked at him the first morning on the boarding house porch. That careful, unsentimental taking of measure, then we don't run from this. He stared at her. Silas is going to make a move, she said. You know it and I know it. So we need to be ready. She pulled the letter toward her and read it again more carefully. Write to Dobbins. Tell him to prepare documentation of the marriage and file it properly. I want copies of everything. She looked up. And Caleb, yes. Next time there is something I need to know. Tell me, not a request, not a threat. Just the terms, he nodded. Yes, he said. Silas Harmon arrived on a Thursday, not with a scene, not with shouting. That was the thing about Silas that Caleb had always found more unsettling than overt hostility. He was quiet about it, calm. the calm of someone who had planned his moves several turns ahead. He came with a man named Pruitt, not introduced as a lawyer, but Pruitt had lawyer's eyes, the kind that took inventory of everything in a room and assigned values. They knocked. Caleb answered. Silas said, "Brother," in a tone of absolute pleasantness. Pruitt said nothing. Caleb let them in. "Because what else do you do?" Nora came from the kitchen. Silas looked at her with the same pleasantness and said, "So this is the bride." Not unkindly. "Just assessing Nora Harmon," she said. "Not nice to meet you. Not any social ornamentation. Just her name. Stated like a fact." Silas smiled. Of course, they sat in the main room. Nora brought coffee without being asked. Then she sat down. Not in the kitchen, not anywhere else. Right there by the fire. Looking at Silas with complete calm, making it absolutely clear she was not leaving. Silas spoke to Caleb as if she weren't there, which was its own kind of answer about who he was. The conversation was pleasant on the surface and a legal negotiation underneath. Silas had spoken with people in Clearwater. He knew the timeline. He was concerned, he said, about whether the marriage met the terms of their father's will, whether there hadn't been perhaps some element of arrangement. Caleb said, "She's my wife," Silas said. "Of course she is." The way he said of course both times. When they left, Nora stood at the window and watched their horses until they were out of sight. Then she said, "He's already talked to a real lawyer." "Yes." "He's going to file something." "Yes." "How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe." "He'll want to move before spring." Nora turned from the window. Her face was completely still, not frightened, not angry. That calculating look, the one he'd first seen in the Ironwood Saloon. The one that meant, "I am looking at this problem, and I am going to solve it." "Then we need to be ready," she said. The blizzard came on a weekend, 2 days in. No outside work possible. The world reduced to the house and the barn and the rope Caleb had strung between them for exactly this kind of weather. Day 1 was fine. They worked inside. Nora on her documentation. Caleb on tack that needed mending. They ate well because she had stocked the kitchen with deliberate care. Day 2 was different. Because there is only so long two people can be confined together before the silence between them changes character. It started with cards. He taught her poker. She beat him in the third hand, and he looked at her and she said, "My father taught me cribbage." The principal's transfer. You could have mentioned that. You could have asked. They played 6 more hands. She won 4. He won 2 and suspected she let him. Then she read aloud from Middlemarch for an hour, and he sat by the fire and listened and discovered, against all his expectations, that he cared what happened to Dorothea Brooke. Then they cooked dinner together. Her idea, not a task to be done but a project. She had found dried chiles in the back of the pantry and had opinions about them. He found this extremely funny for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. She found his amusement annoying and said so. He laughed anyway. She eventually, against her will, laughed too. Then it was evening, still storming. He started telling a story about being 16 and trying to ride a wild Mustang named Chaos, who had been described to him as completely unrideable, and why that description had seemed like a challenge rather than a warning. The Mustang threw him into Callaway Creek in February. He had been, he explained, very cold. Nora was laughing before he got to the creek part. Real laughter. The same laughter as the barn, startled out of her by something she hadn't been bracing for. Her hand came out and landed on his arm, not deliberately, just movement following feeling, and she was laughing too hard to be self-conscious. And he was laughing too, and the storm outside was doing its worst, and it mattered not at all. Her hand on his arm, warm. Even through the fabric, he put his hand over hers. Just rested it there. Her laughter slowed. The fire crackled. "Thank you," she said. "Quiet now. For falling in a creek at 16. For being patient with me." Her voice had gone careful, like she was choosing each word specifically. "For not demanding more than I was ready to give. For making me feel like this is actually mine. The ranch, the work, all of it. You've never made me feel like a guest." He looked at the fire. She was right. He hadn't. He'd been deliberate about that. But hearing her say it did something he hadn't anticipated. "You don't have to thank me for treating you with basic decency," he said. "You'd be surprised," she said very quietly, "how rare it is." He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and then she leaned forward, just slightly, just enough, and kissed him. Not on the cheek, on his mouth. Brief, tentative, a question with her lips. He answered carefully, both hands at her waist, letting her lead, letting her decide the shape of it. She pulled back, stayed close. "I'm not in love with you yet," she said. Direct as always. "I know, but I trust you." A pause. "And I think that might matter more." Right now, he looked at her in the firelight, at the woman who had walked 15 miles in a blizzard, who had sat down across from a stranger and calculated her odds and said yes, who had read Dobbins's letter and said, "We don't run from this," who had spent 7 weeks learning every inch of a place she'd never seen and making it hers through the sheer force of paying attention. "I love you," he said. Her eyes went wide. Then soft. "I've been afraid to say it for weeks. But I do." He held her gaze. "I love your stubbornness. I love the way you approach a problem like it's already solved and you just need to find the solution. I love that you beat me at poker, without mentioning you knew the principles. I love that you talk to the cattle. I love that you've read half my mother's library in 7 weeks, and you put each book back exactly where you found it." He paused. "I love that you're here, that you chose this. I want to spend the rest of my life being worth choosing." The fire, the storm. Her eyes. "Say it again," she said. "I love you, Nora Harmon." She was quiet for a long moment, then, "I'm falling in love with you." "I think I have been for a while." She looked at their joined hands. "I was afraid to admit it, afraid it was too fast, too unlikely. Nothing about us has been conventional." "No," she almost smiled. "It hasn't." He lifted her hand, held it properly, like something he intended to keep. "Give me time," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The notice from the circuit court came on a Monday, formal, official. Silas Harmon versus the estate of Robert Harmon, with Caleb as named party. The filing alleged that the marriage between Caleb Harmon and one Nora Whitfield had been contracted under circumstances suggesting fraudulent intent to circumvent the testamentary provisions of the late Robert Harmon. Caleb read it at the kitchen table, with the stillness of a man receiving news he'd been expecting and had still not fully prepared for. Nora read it over his shoulder. She said, "When's the hearing?" 3 weeks. She nodded, went back to what she'd been doing. That evening, after supper, she sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen and started writing. Caleb watched from across the table. "What are you writing?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Every day since we arrived. What we did. What decisions we made. Who knows us. What the ranch looks like. What's in the root cellar. The names of every animal on this property." She looked up briefly. "A woman who's been on a property for 7 weeks and can tell a judge the name of every horse and the state of every fence line and the weight gain of the cattle since January is not. A woman who was put here to sign a document." He looked at her. She went back to writing. He thought, "I do not deserve her." He also thought, "I am going to spend a significant portion of my life making sure she never regrets this." The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in February. The circuit court in Clearwater, a single room in the back of the county building, was presided over by Judge Harlan Greer, who was 63 years old, deeply unimpressed by people wasting his time, and constitutionally incapable of being manipulated by anyone's lawyer into anything. Pruitt was good. Caleb had to give him that. He laid out the timeline with precision. 24 hours between first meeting and wedding ceremony. No courtship. No period of acquaintance. A woman alone, without resources, facing a Wyoming winter without shelter. A man with a pressing legal deadline on a property he stood to partially lose if unmarried before a specific date. Fraud, Pruitt said. Not loudly, quietly. With the confidence of someone who believes the facts support the word. Caleb's lawyer, a younger man named Garrett, not as polished as Pruitt but honest, argued the facts of the marriage's subsequent nature. 7 weeks of living and working together on the property. A functioning marriage by any observable measure, Judge Greer listened. Halt Cutter testified. He told the truth, the whole truth, because that was what Cutter did. He'd seen Nora walk into the Ironwood. He'd seen Caleb stand up. He'd spoken to Caleb the morning of the wedding and raised concerns about motivation. He could not say with certainty what Caleb Harmon's primary motivation had been. He could say that Caleb Harmon was, in his 19 years of knowing him, a man whose word meant what it said. Pruitt tried to use that. The uncertainty. They could not say with certainty. And then Nora stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Garrett. She simply stood. Judge Greer looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "you have something to add?" "Yes, Your Honor." She spoke for 12 minutes. No notes. No performance. She spoke the way she did everything. Directly, precisely, without ornamentation. She named every animal on the Harmon property. She described the state of the east fence line when she arrived and the state of it now. She detailed the root cellar inventory in January versus February. She explained the decision they'd made together about the South Pasture's winter grazing rotation. She described the book she was currently reading from the library and where it sat on the shelf and what the spine looked like, and then she said, "I walked 15 miles in a December storm to find work. Mr. Harmon offered me something better. I thought about it for one night, and I said yes. Not because I was desperate enough to accept anything." She looked at Pruitt without expression. "Because he stood up when no one else did. Because in 7 weeks on that ranch, I have never once been made to feel like anything less than an equal partner in running it." She sat down, silence in the room. Judge Greer looked at Silas, then at Pruitt, then he said, "A woman who has been on that land for 7 weeks and can tell me the name of every horse and the weight of the root cellar inventory is not a woman who was brought there to satisfy a legal deadline." He shuffled his papers. Petition denied. Silas left without looking at Caleb. Pruitt left without looking at anyone outside the courthouse. Snow. Again. Because Wyoming Caleb stood in it and looked at his wife. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did." She met his eyes. "You kept your word to me. I kept mine to you." A pause. "Steady. That's how this works." He looked at her for a long moment, then he pulled her toward him, both arms around her. Right there on the courthouse steps in the snow in front of whoever happened to be looking. She went still for half a second. Surprised, then she put her arms around him too. She held on. 3 nights later. After midnight. The smell reached Caleb before the sound did. Smokes. He was out of bed and down the stairs and out the door before he was fully awake. The horse barn. East corner. An orange glow behind the boards where orange should not be. He ran, got the horses out first. All 6. Cedar last, who was difficult even in a crisis. The smoke was low. The fire had started in the corner that stored old feed and caught fast and bright. He got the horses to the paddock fence and turned back. Nora was in the barn, with a feed sack, beating at the base of the fire where it was still containable. Not panicking, working, like it was the fence line. Like it was a problem with a solution, and she was finding it. They worked together for 20 minutes. The fire died to embers and then to nothing. The east corner of the barn was blackened, and the stored feed was lost, but the structure held and the horses were safe. They stood in the dark after, both of them, covered in smoke and cold, and the exhaustion of adrenaline burned through. Caleb looked at the burn pattern. At the origin point, at the corner that backed up against the tree line, where the light from the house wouldn't reach, he looked at the ground. A partial boot print, smaller than his, smaller than any of the ranch hands, and near the origin point, a crushed tobacco tin, small, familiar. Sis's had a brand. He smoked one particular kind of tobacco. The tin was that kind. Caleb picked it up, felt the weight of what it meant. He went inside. got his rifle from above the door. He was halfway to the stable, moving fast, not thinking past the next 5 minutes, running on something older and simpler than thought, when Nora's hands caught his arm hard. "Both of them, Caleb," he stopped. "Didn't turn, look at me," he turned. She was in the doorway, lamp in one hand, the other on his arm. Her face completely clear of everything except presence, just there, looking at him with those eyes she's carrying. He said he hadn't meant to say it that way. Hadn't meant to say it at all. Not yet. It was too early to be certain, but it was the truest thing in that moment, and it came out because she was looking at him. And he could not lie to that look. She. The words sat in the air between them. Something moved across Nora's face. Something large and complex and quiet all at once. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Put the rifle down, Caleb." Her voice was even. Steady as it always was. "Silas did this. I know he could have. I know, tighter. More weight in it. Put the rifle down." He stood in the dark yard in the smell, rifle in his hands, the trees at the edge of the property black against the sky. Somewhere out there, his brother. Somewhere in here, the future. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. He hung the rifle back above the door, turned back to the yard. Nora was still in the doorway, lamp still burning. He walked back to her. She let him in. The door closed behind them both. He stood in the kitchen in the dark and did not speak. And she stood beside him and did not speak either, and the fire in the stove burned low, and the smoke smell followed them in. And eventually she said, very quietly, "We'll report the fire to Marshal Cutter in the morning. We'll tell him about the tin. Let the law handle, Silas." He nodded. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. Flat, steady, just her palm there. "You could have gone," she said. "A lot of men would have gone, I know. But you stayed." He looked at her hand on his face, at the lamp throwing her shadow long behind her. "Yes," he said. She looked back. "A long time. That's who you are," she said finally. Not an accusation, not a compliment. Just a recognition. An acknowledgement of something she had been observing for weeks and had only now decided to name. She lowered her hand. "Go to bed," she said. "I'll check the barn one more time first. Nora, I'll check the barn, firm. Final. You go to bed." He went upstairs. He lay in the small room at the end of the hall and stared at the ceiling. He heard her come in from the barn, heard her stop in the hallway, and then, the part he would remember for the rest of his life, a pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4, of absolute stillness in the hallway outside his door, then a knock, 3 times quiet. He said, "Come in." Morning came differently after that, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just differently. The way light changes when a season turns. Gradual, undeniable. Something that had been one thing becoming, quietly and without ceremony, another thing entirely. Caleb woke first. As always, before dawn, before the birds still mostly absent from the Wyoming winter, before everything. Except this morning he lay still for a moment instead of rising immediately, listening to the sound of another person breathing in the dark. A sound he had not heard in 18 months. A sound he had not let himself miss, because missing it would have required admitting how large the absence was. He got up carefully, dressed in the dark, went downstairs. He put water on to heat, not coffee, tea. She had a preference. He'd noticed it early on, how she held the coffee mug differently than the tea mug. The coffee with both hands cupped around it for warmth, the tea held by the handle like someone who actually intended to enjoy it, rather than just survive it. He made the tea, set it on the small tray, carried it as upstairs, set it outside the bedroom door. Not with a flower this time. He'd left a wildflower 2 weeks ago and she'd kept it. Pressed it between the pages of Middlemarch, which was not the subtlest thing she'd ever done. This morning, just the tea, the ordinary ongoing thing. The signal that required no explanation, because they were, gradually, building a language between them that didn't need many words. He went back downstairs and started the coffee for himself, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the dawn come up over the east pasture. He heard her open the bedroom door. He heard the soft sound of the tray being lifted. He did not hear her come downstairs for another 20 minutes. And when she did, she was dressed, and her hair was braided. And she set the empty teacup on the counter and said, "The gray mare is favoring her left foreleg again. I saw it yesterday," he said. "I'll check her after breakfast. I'll come." "You don't have to, I know." And that was that. Spring arrived without asking permission, the way Wyoming spring always did. Not gently, not gradually. One week the world was frozen, and the next the creek was running fast and loud, and the mud season had begun, which was its own category of miserable. And then somehow, impossibly, every year, the grass came back, green, actual green. Under the snowmelt and the mud and the weeks of brown nothing, the grass came back. Nora stood at the kitchen window the morning she first saw it clearly. Just stood there. Coffee going cold in her hand. Caleb came in from the barn and found her like that. Looked at what she was looking at. Didn't say anything. After a minute she said, "My father used to say that spring was proof the world meant to continue." He stood beside her. "I think I understand what he meant now," she said. He looked at the green pasture, then at her, the way the light hit her face in the morning. The color of her eyes, that green, the one he'd thought about in the dark of Mrs. Weston's parlor, the one that had not stopped meaning something to him in the months since. The slight roundness beginning at her middle, that was still subtle enough to be deniable, but not to him. Not anymore. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it, just slightly. The world, continuing. Edmund was born on the 14th of September, which was, as Nora pointed out afterward, with the dry precision that was purely hers, exactly 9 months and 2 weeks, after a December blizzard and a man standing up in a saloon. She said this to Constance Yarrow, their neighbor, who had come to help with the birth, and Constance laughed so hard she had to sit down. Caleb was not in the room for the birth itself. This was not unusual for 1878. He paced the length of the house for approximately 6 hours. 480 lengths, which was coincidentally the same number as the acreage of the Harmon spread, which he did not think was funny at all. When Constance finally opened the bedroom door and nodded at him, he took the stairs 2 at a time. Nora, exhausted, pale, hair damp against her neck, but her eyes fully present, looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, soft in a way that was not less strong. Soft the way something is when it no longer needs armor, in her arms, wrapped in the quilted blanket her mother had made, and that she had carried from St. Louis through 6 weeks of westward travel in a bag that held almost nothing else. Edmund Small, red. Furious at the situation in the way of newborns who have been evicted from somewhere comfortable into somewhere cold and loud dark hair. Already, a ridiculous amount of it. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, took his son with hands that had pulled calves into the world, and reset fence posts, in frozen ground, and once held a rifle in the dark, because something old and angry had demanded it. Edmund looked up at him, or in his direction, with the unfocused uncertainty of someone who had not yet fully committed to the concept of vision, and Caleb Harmon, who had not cried in public since his mother died, felt something move through him that had no name. Not just love, something older than love. Something that felt like responsibility, but the kind you choose rather than the kind assigned. The kind that changes the shape of your days permanently and you want it to. "Edmund," he said, Nora's hand on his arm. "Thomas was my father's name," she said. "Edmund was my grandfather's. Edmund Thomas Harmon." Caleb said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He held his son. Outside, the September sun was doing its last warm work before autumn came. The east pasture caught it at an angle that made the grass look gold. The horses moved through it unhurried, the ranch, the family. The thing his parents had started, and he had nearly let go to stillness and grief and 11 nights in a saloon staring at a warm whiskey glass. Not going to ground now, growing the horse program was Nora's idea first. Or rather, It had been Caleb's dream, and she turned it from a dream into a plan, which is the more difficult half of the operation. She'd been watching him with the horses since January. How they moved for him. How Cedar, who trusted no one, had started coming to the fence when she heard his voice. How he managed the horses like he was in conversation with them, not like he was managing an asset. She said, "You could sell the colts. Not just for ranch work, for quality. People in Denver would pay serious money for horses trained the way you train them," he said. "It takes capital to start something like that," she said. "Then we'll save. We'll build toward it, that will." He did not stop hearing that will for weeks. By the spring, after Edmund's birth, they had the beginning of a breeding program. By the following autumn, their first sale went to a buyer from Cheyenne, who had heard about the Harmon horses from Everett Yarrow, who had heard it from someone else, the way word travels in a territory where good things are worth knowing about. The buyer shook Caleb's hand and said, "Where did you learn to work with them like this?" Caleb said. "My father taught me most of it. He didn't say, and my wife told me it was worth building, but he thought it." Nora's school started the autumn Edmund turned 2, not a formal school, not at first. The children of 2 neighboring families, whose nearest town was a day's ride away, and whose parents wanted them to read and cipher before they were old enough to work full-time. Nora set up the second parlor with a blackboard that Caleb built over a winter weekend, and benches that Everett Yarrow donated from his barn. 6 children the first autumn. 11 by the following year. Caleb added a second room to the school building in the spring. Without being asked, Nora found him framing it on a Saturday and stood watching him and then said, "You knew I'd need more space. You had 11 children in a room built for 6. You could have waited until I asked. You were going to ask next week." She looked at him. "How did you know?" "You'd been measuring the room with your eyes for about 10 days. Since the Pemberton children started, she was quiet for a moment, then, "You pay attention. Always," he said, and went back to the framing. She stood there another minute, then went inside to plan the new room's layout, before the walls were even up. A decade passes faster than anyone tells you it will, and slower than you think you can bear at the time. And both of those things are true simultaneously, which is one of the stranger aspects of living an actual life rather than thinking about 5 children. Edmund first, then the twins, Clara and June, who arrived simultaneously in a manner that surprised everyone, including Dr. Aldrich, who had delivered approximately 300 babies in Clearwater and claimed twins never got easier to receive. Then Wesley, then Barnett, who came late and easy and seemed from birth to have decided that the world was not something to be alarmed about. The house expanded. The ranch expanded. The horse program became, by 1885, the thing the name Harmon was most associated with in 3 counties. People came from as far as Denver. Once from Kansas City, Nora taught. Caleb ranched. They argued about money and decisions, and occasionally about each other's stubbornness, which was considerable on both sides. They made up. They worked. They read in the evenings by the fire. She still read aloud sometimes. And he still found himself caring about people in books in ways he hadn't expected. They built something, not a dream, something better than a dream, a real thing. With mud on it and difficult winters, and 2 years where the cattle prices were so low they ate simply, and spent nothing that wasn't necessary, and years where the horses sold well, and they put new glass in the east windows. And Nora ordered 20 new books from a printer in Chicago, and they arrived in a crate that she opened with the expression she only ever showed when something genuinely delighted her. 10 years, and then Silas came back spring 1887. Edmund was 8, nearly 9. The twins were 6. Wesley was 4. Barnett had just turned 2 and was conducting a sustained personal campaign against every fence latch on the property. Caleb saw him first, a man on a horse at the end of the road, moving slowly. The slowness of someone who is not sure of their welcome and is giving the house time, to see them coming and decide. Caleb knew the shape of that horse, knew the shape of the man on it. He put down what he was doing. He didn't go inside for the rifle. He just stood and waited. Silas looked older, more than 10 years older, the specific aging of a man who has lived roughly, which Silas apparently had. Thinner. The expensive-looking polish he'd worn to the courthouse was entirely gone. He sat on a horse that was serviceable, but nothing more. He wore a coat that had seen better winters. He stopped at the gate, looked at Caleb. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. His voice was older too. Caleb said nothing. "I know I don't have any right to be here." Silas looked at the house, at the barn, at the pastures where the horses moved in the spring light. "I just wanted to see it." Once more. "Dad built it." He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I wanted to see what you'd done with it." Caleb stood at the gate. The late afternoon light hit the ranch the way it always hit it this time of year, at an angle that made everything look deliberate. The new barn wing, the school addition visible behind the house, the east pasture fence, rebuilt fully now, running straight and clean to the tree line. He felt a hand on his back. Nora. He hadn't heard her come out, but there she was, standing just behind his left shoulder, not pushing, not holding him back, just present. The way she always was when something required more than one person. He felt the weight of her hand through his coat, not an instruction, not a warning, just, "I'm here, whatever you decide." He looked at his brother, at the man who had filed a court petition to take his land, who had burned the east corner of his horse barn in the dark of a winter night, who had spent most of his life wanting what his older brother had and not knowing how to want it without trying to take it, his father's son, also. His brother. He opened the gate. "You'll eat with us tonight," he said. Silas looked at him, at the open gate. Back at him, he dismounted slowly, led his horse through. He did not look up for a long time. From the kitchen window, Caleb knew without looking. Edmund and the twins were watching, because children always found the window in moments like this. And what they saw their father do at this gate on this afternoon would be something they carried. Not as a story told to them, as a thing they witnessed, which was entirely different. Silas ate dinner with them that evening. He was quiet. He spoke when spoken to. He answered Edmund's questions about where he'd been, with the careful evasiveness of a man who had been several places he'd rather not describe to a child. When he left the next morning, he shook Caleb's hand. He looked at Nora. He said, "You've made something good here," she said. "We have, not correcting him, not performing grace, just accurate." Silas nodded, got on his horse, rode south. They never saw him again. The years continued to do what years do, which is, accumulate. Edmund grew into a young man with his mother's eyes and his father's steadiness, which was, Nora said, an excellent combination and also occasionally exhausting. He started working the ranch properly at 14, and by 18 was managing the horse program with a competence that Caleb feels something beyond pride. The satisfaction of watching something you built develop a life of its own. The satisfaction of realizing it no longer needs you in the same way, and wanting that for it. The twins were something else entirely. Clara was fierce and mathematical, and wanted to study medicine, which in 1892 was not simple, and which she pursued with the stubbornness she had clearly inherited equally from both parents. June was quieter, a reader, most often found in the library, with 3 books open at once, and who eventually became a teacher herself, in a way that made Nora's face go soft every time she thought about it. Wesley ranched, cheerfully. Without complication, Barnett, who had decided as a toddler that the world was not something to be alarmed about, grew into a man who was not alarmed by anything, which made him exceptional in a crisis and occasionally disconcerting in ordinary life. 5 children. The house they'd made was full of them for years, and then gradually less full as they grew into their own lives and their own choices. And the house changed shape again, not smaller, but quieter, more space between things. The way a house feels when it has been lived in hard and well and is now being lived in differently. Nora kept teaching until 1910. 30 years in that classroom, she'd started with 6 children, and a blackboard Caleb had built. By the time she retired, there were 40 children in the school, and a proper teacher had been hired by the county. A teacher Nora had trained herself, which was, she said, the best possible outcome. She did not stop reading. She did not stop paying attention. She did not stop making tea in the morning and holding the mug by the handle. He had been listening to her hum for 47 years. He still didn't know what all the songs were. He had never asked. Some things you don't interrupt. The winters got harder as they got older. Not the winters themselves. Wyoming did not adjust its weather for the comfort of aging bodies. But the experience of the winters changed. The cold found different ways in. The joints that had worked fence lines in frozen ground for decades had opinions about it now. The walk from the house to the barn, 40 feet in good weather, a negotiation in bad, required more thought than it used to. They slowed down, not stopped. Slowed. Caleb still went out in the morning, still checked the stock, still walked the pastures, though Edmund or Wesley was usually with him now, which he pretended not to need, and everyone pretended not to notice he needed. Nora still read, still wrote letters. She had correspondence with Clara in Denver and June in Laramie, and with 2 other women teachers she had been exchanging ideas with for 20 years. Still sat at the kitchen table in the mornings with her tea and the window light and the book she was currently working through. Still hummed while she cooked. The winter of 1924 was the hard one. December came early and stayed. The cold was the kind that settled into the house through every gap that age had opened in them. The logs and the mortar, and the places where the building had shifted slightly over half a century of being lived in. Caleb spent 3 days resealing what he could reach. Edmund came and did what Caleb couldn't. Nora said the cold was fine. She said it in the tone that meant she was choosing to mean it, which was different from meaning it without choosing. She tired more easily. Had been tiring more easily since October. She tired and didn't complain and kept doing everything she intended to do, just more slowly. Just with more rest built in. He moved his chair closer to the fire without mentioning it. She accepted the proximity without mentioning it. This was how they had always operated. 47 years of building a shorthand that covered most of what needed saying. January. She stopped going out to the barn with him in the mornings. He didn't say anything about this. She didn't explain it. He checked the stock alone, in the cold, and came back. And she had his coffee ready, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she told him what she'd been thinking about while he was outside, which was often interesting and sometimes surprising, and occasionally an opinion about something he'd done 20 years ago that she had apparently been sitting on and had only now decided to release. He listened. He always listened. February brought a thaw. Brief. A week of almost warmth that made the snow pull from south-facing slopes and let the creek run louder. Nora sat on the porch one afternoon in the weak sun. Just sat, not reading, not writing. Just watching the pasture. Caleb came and sat beside her. They watched the horses move through the south field. Edmund's horses now mostly, though there were 2 mares that had always been Caleb's and would be until the end. I was thinking. Nora said. All right, about that first ride. When you brought me out here, she was quiet for a moment, her hands in her lap. The hands he had watched work and write and hold books and deliver calves and hold children and move through every season of this life. You pointed out that creek. The one that never freezes completely, I remember. You said the cattle know to go there when the topwater's iced over. They do. She turned and looked at him, full on. The direct look. The one she'd given him in the Ironwood Saloon when she'd asked, "Are you a man who keeps his word?" The one that had not changed in 47 years. The look that saw through the front of things to what was actually there. I would do it again, she said. Every cold mile of it, he held her gaze. Every frozen step from Grover Station. Her voice was even. Not performing steadiness. Just steady. Every minute of that first awful night in the blizzard, before Dr. Aldrich found me. Every terrifying second of saying yes to a man I'd known for 20 minutes. She reached over and put her hand on his. I would do all of it again, exactly the same way. To get to this, he turned his hand over, held hers properly. So would I, he said. Every single moment, the creek in the distance, running loud and clear in the thaw, the horses in the south pasture, the mountains white against a winter sky. He held her hand in the cold air, and they sat together while the sun did its small February work, and the world was exactly what it was. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, not without loss and difficulty and years that cost more than others, but real, completely real, built by hand over decades, from something that had started as a practical arrangement between two desperate people in a December storm. Built into this. She died in March, on a morning when the snow was finally pulling back and the first suggestions of actual spring were appearing at the edges of things. The room was warm. Edmund had come. Clara had made the trip from Denver. The others were there. Caleb was there. He was always there. She had been less pres for several days, drifting, sleeping more, the retreat that the body makes when it is finishing. But that last morning she was clear, fully there, looking around the room at her children with an expression he recognized. The inventory look, checking, making sure everything was in order. It was. It had always been. She looked at him last. She said his name, just his name. The way she had said it 10,000 times, in ordinary conversation and in arguments and in the dark and in the mornings, and once memorably, in the middle of a dinner party when he'd said something she'd found unforgivably funny and was trying not to show it, just his name. With everything it had accumulated, he held her hand, he said, "I'm here." And then she was gone. He kept his promise. She had asked him to keep living, for the children, for the grandchildren, for the ongoing thing they had built together that did not stop because one of them stopped. He kept his promise. It was not easy. Nothing worth doing was easy. She had known that, had said so, had demonstrated it every day for 47 years. He went out in the mornings. He walked the pastures with Edmund. He sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and looked at the window. She had stood it every morning of their life together, looking out at whatever the season offered. The wild flowers in June, the gold aspens in October, the first snow. He put the kettle on every morning, not for the tea, just the kettle, the sound of it, the routine of it. The 47 years of water heated before the day began because that was how mornings worked in this house. He talked to her, not always out loud, mostly in the way you talk to someone who has been so thoroughly woven into your thinking that the conversation never fully stops cuts, even when one side of it goes quiet. He told her things. About the horses, about Edmund's new breeding program, doing even better than theirs had, about Clara's medical practice, about June's daughter who had her grandmother's green eyes, exact shade, which he had noticed immediately, and which had done something to him he was not prepared for. He told her about the grandchildren. He told her about the spring grass coming back, about the creek running loud after snowmelt, about the morning light on the east pasture, all the ordinary things that had made up a life, all the things she would have wanted to know. He lived. He kept his word, 14 months after she died. On a morning in May, when the wildflowers were doing their best work on the lower slope, and the air smelled like everything beginning, Caleb Harmon lay down for his afternoon rest, and did not wake up. Edmund found him with the look of a man who had finished what he set out to do. They buried him on the hill that looked down over all of it, the south pasture and the horse fields and the schoolhouse addition and the creek that never froze completely. The hill where the grass came in earliest in spring, and where Nora had once stood at sunset and said the light was the most specific shade of gold she'd ever seen. Edmund chose the stone. He thought a long time about what to put on it. He had heard the story his whole life. The blizzard, the saloon, the man who stood up, the woman who said yes. He had grown up understanding that the story of how his parents met was the kind of story that people told because it meant something. Not because it was romantic, though it was, in its own unsentimental way, but because it was true. About what people are capable of when they choose each other with their eyes open. What he put on the stone was not the romance. It was the fact sinful, direct, the way his mother would have wanted, the way his whole father would have approved. Caleb Harmon, 1847. 1925 Nora Harmon, 1855. 1924 He stood up when no one else would. She walked until she found the door. They built the rest together. The ranch is still there, fourth generation now. Edmund's grandchildren. Moving through the same pastures, working the same creek, looking at the same mountains that do not adjust themselves for anyone. Every winter, when the first real snow comes, and the wind works against the house, and the cold settles into the valley the way it always has, Edmund's daughter, the one with the green eyes, gathers the children. She tells the story. She starts the same way Edmund always started it. The same way his mother told it to him when he was small, sitting by the fire in the Histonks Ford Daffer built. Your great-grandmother walked 15 miles in a blizzard the night she met your great-grandfather. The children sit. They listen. They have heard it before. They will hear it again. Because it is the kind of story that means something different every time you hear it, depending on how old you are, and what you know about how hard things can be, and what it costs to choose someone and stay chosen, and build something together that outlasts you. What it says, if you listen to all of it, is this: desperation can be a beginning. A stranger can become the person you cannot imagine having not known. Trust, chosen carefully and kept faithfully, becomes love. And love, tended like good land, worked and sometimes hard and never neglected, becomes something that outlasts the people who made it. The kettle on in the morning, the tea held by the handle, the hand on a shoulder that says without words, I'm here, whatever you decide, 47 years of that. And then what it leaves behind, which is everything. Which is this, the hill with the two stones, the creek that never freezes completely, the story told again on a winter night, the green eyes in the next generation, the ongoing life of what two people built when they chose each other in the dark of a December storm and decided, against all reasonable expectation, to mean it.